ABC General Hospital, spoilers reveal that Britt had always believed she understood the rules of survival. But nothing had prepared her for the kind of quiet surgical control Ross Cullum was imposing on her now. A control so precise and insidious that it felt like every breath she took belonged to someone else. The injections were no longer just medication or protocol, they were a rewriting of her story from the inside out. A slow recalibration of her body and mind that turned each moment into a test of endurance. Every time the needle pierced her skin, she felt the boundaries of her autonomy shrinking, as if Cullum were tightening invisible strings and adjusting her reactions the way a scientist might tune the settings. On an experiment. Each new directive he gave, each alteration to her dosage, became part of a deliberate pattern. A cycle that reinforced itself until Britt could no longer tell where her fear ended and his control began. What frightened her most was not the pain or the weakness, but the realization that these adjustments were not random. They were orchestrated to mold her into exactly what he needed her to be, pushing her deeper into a narrative she had never agreed to and never imagined herself trapped within. The laboratory lights seemed harsher each day, reflecting her growing dread as she felt the toxins seep deeper into her bloodstream, rewriting her impulses, numbing her clarity, turning her into the compliant assistant he insisted was essential for the new phase of whatever secret project he refused to explain. Cullum spoke about progress as if it were a virtue, a necessity, a form of evolution that Britt should be grateful to participate in. But beneath his clinical tone lurked an unmistakable hunger for control, a subtle sadism disguised as professional obligation. He added new restrictions whenever she showed resistance, new rules, new routines, new injections, each carefully designed to demonstrate that she was no longer the one deciding how her story unfolded. The new adjustments, the new requirements he insisted she follow, were becoming the spine of a chilling metamorphosis, proving that the narrative was shifting into something far darker than she initially understood. Britt felt herself becoming a character inside a story he was crafting around her, one where every change he introduced fed into something larger, something escalating, something that seemed to tighten its grip on her with each passing hour. She could sense a growing tension in the air, a crescendo building beneath the surface, as though Cullum's project, whatever cruel purpose it served, was reaching a critical point. Every injection became a reminder that he was not merely medicating her, he was conditioning her, calibrating her responses, altering her sense of reality until she could barely distinguish genuine thoughts from the fog he induced. Yet somewhere deep beneath the layers of chemical obedience, a spark of resistance remained, flickering like a faint heartbeat in the darkness, insisting she had not completely surrendered. Still, Cullum's adjustments continued, each one more invasive than the last. He monitored her stamina, her emotional volatility, the subtle tremors in her hands, scribbling notes that she suspected were less about her well-being and more about perfecting his method of domination. The new narrative he was crafting around her life was airtight, calculated, relentless, suffocating. Britt realized that she was not merely facing a medical crisis, she was being folded into a larger conspiracy. A rewritten version of reality where she served as the perfect instrument of his design. The changes he forced upon her were becoming more extreme, more noticeable, as though he wanted her aware enough to feel the terror but weakened enough to never escape it. Every moment under his supervision felt like a test of her breaking point. Would she resist? Would she collapse? Would she finally become the pliable figure he envisioned? She understood now that the injections were not just controlling her, they were silencing her, erasing layers of her identity, while manufacturing a new version of her that fit seamlessly into his plan. And yet, in the hollow spaces between the injections, when her mind briefly lifted from the chemical haze, she sensed something else, shifting something in Cullum himself. His behavior had grown more erratic, more urgent, as if the story he was crafting was spiraling beyond even his control. His obsession with her compliance had intensified, and the adjustments he kept introducing revealed not confidence but desperation. It was as though he feared she might recover enough clarity to expose him, to dismantle whatever sinister architecture he was constructing behind laboratory doors. The more he forced these changes upon her, the more obvious it became that he was fighting his own slipping grip on the narrative, terrified that the story he built might collapse if she regained even a fraction of her power. Britt realized that his need to control her was becoming its own unraveling proof that something bigger and more volatile was coming, something he was scrambling to hide. The injections continued, each new dose a reminder that she was dancing along the edge of a dangerous transformation that might erase her entirely. Yet each adjustment he made, each shift in dosage, each new restriction, each carefully timed act of dominance only strengthened her understanding of the truth. She was not the helpless subject he believed she had become. The story was changing, yes, but not solely under his direction. The very new adjustments Cullum relied on to tighten his control were revealing cracks in his strategy, exposing fear and instability he could no longer mask. Britt began to see that the escalating control was not just a tactic, it was a confession. Cullum was racing against time, terrified of losing command over the weapon he was crafting from her body. And in recognizing that fear, Britt rediscovered the beginning of her strength. The injections might slow her limbs, cloud her thoughts, weaken her breath, but they could not extinguish the truth. Forming in her mind, the story was not finished, not yet, and she still had the power to rewrite its ending. Jason could feel the weight of every decision pressing against him, as if the walls themselves were tightening around. His conscience, the changes he was trying to make, the adjustments he believed would pull Britt out of Cullum's grip, were no longer small interventions, but tectonic shifts capable of cracking open everything beneath them. He had started simply with an attempt to retrieve a vial, a fragment of truth hidden inside a syringe. But the deeper he pushed, the more he realized that the situation was mutating beyond anything he had prepared for. The story was changing, twisting into something more dangerous. And every calculated step he took to save Britt only pulled him further into a labyrinth shaped by someone else's unseen hand. It was no longer just about a toxin or a forced injection. Cullum had created an entire structure of control around her, a narrative that tightened each time Jason attempted to break through. Jason was adjusting strategies, recalibrating instincts, pushing himself to think several moves ahead. But no matter how he shifted his approach, the darkness around Britt only grew thicker. Cullum, in contrast, moved with the eerie serenity of a man completely certain of his power. His experiments were no longer simple trials, they had become a framework for reinvention. A blueprint for reshaping Britt into something he believed was necessary for the new face he kept hinting at. Each change he demanded felt like a forced rewiring of her identity. Each injection carried the unmistakable imprint of a man sculpting a result rather than treating a patient. Cullum saw himself not as a villain, but as an architect, molding outcomes, erasing resistance, preparing Britt for a role she never agreed to play. His control was not just chemical, but psychological, rooted in the belief that he could bend her life into whatever pattern he required. And the worst part, the part that filled Britt with a cold dread, was the way he spoke about the future, as if she were merely a component in a much larger mechanism that was finally being activated. What Jason did not yet understand, though, he felt it like a faint vibration beneath every action, was that Cullum's obsession with Britt was tied to something deeper. Something resurrected from the ashes of a past no one believed could return. Whispers in the corners of Jason's thoughts grew louder. Faison? The possibility that he was still alive was not just a rumor or a hallucination born from trauma. It was a shadow crossing back into the present. Cullum's experiments, the toxins, the controlled adjustments, the insistence on transforming Britt piece by piece, none of it felt random anymore. It felt like preparation, like reconstruction, like revival. As if Cullum were answering to someone who had always thrived on manipulation, fear, and rewriting destinies. If Faison truly lived, then everything Cullum was doing took on a horrifying clarity. Britt was not merely a captive, she was an asset. A living variable in a larger plan that neither she nor Jason fully understood. Jason sensed the shift before he could name it. His attempts to intervene to adjust the course of events were no longer simply efforts to protect Britt. They were acts of defiance against a rising force trying to retake control of a narrative the world thought had ended long ago. Each step forward made him feel the story pulling apart at the seams, revealing new layers, new dangers, new truths that should have stayed buried. The more he pushed, the more resistance he encountered, not just from Cullum but from fate itself. As if the return of Faison cast a gravitational pull that warped every decision, every risk, every possibility. Jason felt something ancient and cold take shape in the margins of the present, something that wanted Britt, wanted Anna, wanted chaos, wanted the world to remember that nightmares never truly die. For Britt, the change was felt in her blood. Each injection carried a different weight, a different intention, a different pattern of side effects that struck her with mechanical precision. Cullum kept adjusting doses, altering formulas, modifying the rhythm of her injections. Each alteration seemed to sync with something external, as if responding to signals she couldn't hear. The experiments were evolving, becoming more synchronized, more deliberate, as though Cullum were tuning her into a frequency she didn't want to comprehend. She began to feel time blur, memory fracture, instinct fade, yet beneath all of that, a terrifying clarity emerged. She was being prepared. Not healed, not punished. Prepared, and as the truth crystallized, the story shifted again, darker, sharper, more relentless than before. Cullum no longer spoke like a man performing isolated tests. He spoke like someone following orders from a commander who demanded precision. His hands shook, not with fear but with anticipation, as though every needle he pressed into Britt brought him one step closer to fulfilling a promise, one that did not originate with him. His eyes gleamed with a fanatic devotion that had nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with science, and everything to do with loyalty to a ghost the world believed had vanished. Jason could feel it now, the unmistakable momentum of something monstrous building behind the scenes. His need to save Britt was no longer simply an act of heroism, it was a desperate attempt to stop the rebirth of a threat he had already fought once, a threat that should never have had the chance to rise again. Every adjustment he made, every move he plotted, every risk he took became a counterstrike against an enemy who had already started rewriting the future. Cullum's changes were escalating. Faison's presence, whether real or shadow, was tightening. Britt's body was becoming the battleground. And Jason was standing at the edge of a story that was changing faster than he could control. Something new was coming. Something inevitable. Something deadly. And this time the adjustments would not be enough. Cullum had crossed a threshold that neither Jason nor Britt fully understood, stepping into a realm of calculation so unhinged that it bent the boundaries of logic itself. What began as a quiet manipulation of Britt's body had evolved into a broader, deeper ambition, one that extended far beyond her blood or her compliance. Cullum no longer acted like a man following instructions. He behaved like someone trying to master the very force he once served, as if he believed he could control Faison himself, rewrite the legacy of chaos that name carried, and reconfigure the events unfolding around him into a narrative he alone dictated. The way he worked, the way he spoke, the way his experiments intensified revealed the truth. He wasn't simply implementing orders, he was trying to surpass. Every adjustment he made on Britt, every calculated delay, every new toxin composition, every shift in her dosage was part of a larger plan that pulsed behind his eyes with a feverish obsession. Cullum wanted command, not obedience. He wanted influence over the storm Faison represented, and he wanted the world reshaped according to his own design. Jason felt the shift like a violent tremor beneath the surface, a warning that the story was mutating into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. Cullum's interference with Faison's legacy meant the stakes were no longer just about saving Britt, they were about preventing a ripple that could unravel everything. The new adjustments Jason was forced to make were no longer tactical, they were existential, driven by the knowledge that he was not dealing with a man who wanted to survive, but a man who wanted to dominate the chaos itself. Jason sensed that Cullum was pushing toward a point of no return, a breaking point where science madness and ambition fused into something catastrophic. He knew he had to move faster, think sharper, change direction before Cullum's grip reached its peak. Every plan Jason constructed had to be torn down and rebuilt in real time. Every instinct he trusted was being challenged by a narrative that kept changing faster than he could react. The danger wasn't linear anymore, it was spiraling. Britt, trapped inside the tightening core of Cullum's intentions, felt the madness more intimately than anyone else. The injections had begun to carry a different weight, a different rhythm, as if they were no longer meant to pacify or control, but to prepare her for something unimaginable. Cullum's eyes no longer carried the hollow certainty of a scientist. They burned with the hunger of someone who believed he could bend fate itself into submission. Britt could feel his calculations pressing against her skin like static electricity, each adjustment to her treatment pushing her toward a threshold she didn't understand. He spoke of progress in fragmented phrases, referencing sequences, triggers new phases, and event corrections, as if the world were a machine and he alone had access to its central control panel. She began to realize that his experiments were not only designed to shape her, they were tests for something larger he intended to unleash. What made the situation even more terrifying was the sense that Cullum wasn't just acting against Jason and Britt, he was acting against Faison. As if he believed he could take the legacy of a man built on terror and obsession and redesign it into something he controlled. Cullum wasn't trying to revive Faison, he was trying to surpass him. The twisted calculations he whispered, the new formulas he created, the experimental variables he imposed onto Britt's body all signaled a desire to rewrite the hierarchy of fear, to take the chaos that Faison embodied and reinterpret it through his own lens. It was madness disguised as innovation, delusion masquerading as evolution. Jason and Britt, whether they realized it or not, had become the counterforce to this rising insanity. The new interactions forming between them, the fear, the urgency, the desperation were not weaknesses but catalysts, pushing them toward the only path that could stop Cullum before he detonated the future. Each forced adjustment in their choices became a piece of a larger resistance, a reaction to the escalating threat. Jason's instincts sharpened to a razor edge. Britt's shrinking clarity fought back with sudden flashes of lucidity. Together they had begun forming a countercurrent to the spiraling narrative Cullum was stitching together. But the danger was evolving faster than they could adapt. Cullum's changes were becoming erratic yet purposeful, like the moves of someone who had already calculated the endgame and no longer cared how violently the middle of the story twisted. The events unfolding were no longer natural, they were engineered, manipulated, warped into a trajectory that carried the fingerprints of a man losing his sanity while believing he was achieving transcendence. He tampered not only with Britt's biology, but with the rhythm of the world around him, orchestrating circumstances that forced Jason, forced Anna, forced everyone into positions he could exploit. This wasn't just a medical conspiracy, it was narrative warfare. And Cullum believed he was winning. The insanity of it all was becoming undeniable. Every new shift, every erratic adjustment, every forced change was proof that Cullum had broken through the boundary of mere scientific ambition and stepped into the territory of delusion-fueled domination. He wanted control over Faison's legend. He wanted control over Britt's fate. He wanted control over the unfolding chain of events. He wanted control over the fear itself. And in that terrifying realization, one thing became unmistakably clear. A new, unhinged transformation was beginning, and Jason and Britt were standing at the center of a storm engineered by a man who believed he could rewrite what should never be touched.